Good evening. This is Laws 11057, Introduction to Law. This is John Milburn. Tonight we're dealing with legal research. We have a lot to cover, but I do want to recap just a bit. In terms of where we're at now, you should have a good understanding of the difference between common law and judge-made law and parliamentary law. You should have a good idea of equity versus common law. You should be able to find the law and have a basic understanding of secondary versus primary sources. You should be able to understand how to consider a statute and interpret it to some degree, but we are going to cover that in more detail shortly. You should understand the difference between state and federal jurisdiction and how that jurisdiction is derived. In other words, some good ideas about the Constitution. You should now be able to write in a manner that is persuasive. You should be able to use the Australian Guide to Legal Citations and be aware of how to footnote reference. You should be able to understand the process by which a bill becomes an Act of Parliament, both at the state level, in Queensland primarily, but the state where you live, or overseas if you are overseas, and at a federal level. You should be able to understand the separation of powers and give a good idea as to the role of the Parliament, the judiciary, and the executive. You should be able to determine where there is a crossover, particularly in terms of Parliament and the executive. You should understand the general rule that legislation overrides case law. And the example that I gave you was the Ridgway against the Queen case. You should have an idea of what we mean by equity and equitable principles and have some idea as to what courts have the power to invoke equitable jurisdiction and which ones don't. You should be able to identify the source of our law, which is primarily parliamentary-made law, but also judge-made law. In terms of parliamentary law, you should have an idea of not only how the law comes into existence, but when it commences, which means having some idea of certain provisions of the Acts Interpretation Act, both federal and state. You should understand what is meant by Hansard and how to reference Hansard. You should know what we mean by second reading speeches, an explanatory memorandum or explanatory notes, as the case may be, at the federal or state level. You should have some idea of delegated legislation, how that works, and how to find delegated legislation. You should be able to understand what we mean by the concept of the Crown and explain what the Crown is and how it fits into the scheme of things. You should be able to have an idea of the monetary limits for courts and some idea of the processes in those various courts and tribunals. That means having an understanding of the adversarial versus the inquisitorial approach. You should be able to address a member of the judiciary or a tribunal in the appropriate manner if you're in court or in a tribunal, or conversely, that same individual if you're in a social setting. You should have some basic idea of criminal procedure and civil trial procedure, and you should now be able to find where to access secondary sources. Some of the ones that we identified back in week 3 were Legalpedia, the Queensland Law Handbook, Queensland Courts website, the Supreme Court of Queensland Library, bench books, including the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act bench book, and perhaps Google Scholar. In terms of legal thinking skills, you should have your preferred method of legal logic and legal writing. In other words, you should have an understanding of what we mean by the acronyms, such as IRAC, MIRAC, CIRAC, or variations to those. You should have some idea of how lawyers reason in terms of deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, reasoning by analogy, and then identify instances of faulty reasoning. All of this means that you should have, by now, some good thinking skills in terms of a lawyer. If you need a refresher, have a look at page 290 of your text in terms of what are the thinking skills that we're talking about. I'm going to stop now, slow the pace down, and then work my way shortly into legal research. Before I do, have I completely daunted you with that list of things that I would hope by now you're able to understand and explain? You've all, yes, daunted? A little bit, says Gay. Yes, says Ainsley. All right. We're a little bit scared? That's good, because sometimes you do your best work when you're a little bit scared. But don't be daunted by it. Just be determined to understand those list of things that I talked about. If you have any questions, then feel free during these sessions to ask, or you ask in your sessions in UCrew and ask your friends. If you need to replay this session so you have a better understanding of that list, do so. Okay. But I'm pleased to see that no one has absolutely panicked and thought that they're not on top of this. Okay, thinking skills. I'm going to stop here and emphasize this for this point. You need to have these attributes as a lawyer, but you also need to have them as a law student. You see, many of the questions that you'll be asked to answer during your studies start with a statement such as, or a word rather, analyze or evaluate or explain, and there is a difference. So the answer that you give is dependent upon what is asked of you. So if you look at page 290 of your text, you'll see that the thinking skills, and there are 6 of them, are interpretation, analysis, evaluation, inference, explanation, and then self-regulation. So interpretation is your ability to determine, for example, the material facts. Can you read something and interpret it and extract from it the material information that is needed? So that's interpretation. Analysis is the ability to identify hidden features. So if you're asked in a question to analyze this statement, what the questioner is asking you to do is identify the hidden features. That's what we mean by analysis. Evaluation means your ability to assess. Inference is your ability to draw a conclusion. An explanation is your ability to communicate some results. So these are the skills, but can you put those into action? That's the question that I need to ask you, to ask yourselves. And understand those terms so that you can write an answer that reflects what is asked of you during an exam. So all of these things that we're talking about are really attributes of a legal practitioner. And have a look at page 296. We touched on that last session, and I think I left you with the thought of going through that list and asking yourself, do you have those attributes? How can you improve on your skills in relation to those attributes? And can they be learned, or must you be born with self-confidence? Can you learn to be fair-minded, or must you be born with fair-mindedness? My short answer is that you can learn all of these skills, or you can develop all of these skills if you've already got them. And as a practicing lawyer, you need to be creative. Now, how do we become creative? Well, we need to think about different opportunities. We need to brainstorm, potentially. We'll do more of that in about week 8. But once we've identified certain things that may be relevant, we need to do our legal research. And when you're doing your research, think about the context of the problem that you have. And in that regard, when you're thinking about the problem and the context of the problem, you'll be identifying those acronyms such as IRAC. Then think about any appropriate legislation that may be relevant. But of course, to do that, you need to find the legislation, you need to find the regulations, and then to determine things like when the Act came into effect. Think about whether there's case law that applies, but we have to find that case law, and we have to determine whether it is case law that is the subject of precedent or whether precedent doesn't apply. And then, of course, we have to present the material well, which means coming back to, say, my sample document. So these are all the basic skills. If you want a refresher on basic skills or how to plan your research, have a look at pages 192 and 196 of your text. All right, so having determined those basic things, you need to identify a search strategy for your legal research. Now, this is really important for the context of your second assessment, the legal toolkit. You see, that legal toolkit is really meant to be a very practical document. As far as I'm concerned, this Introduction to Law course is all about setting a good ground base for you, something that you can use in the future. So your toolkit may be very different to somebody else's toolkit, but you conceivably both get excellent marks. It's something that works for you. And to do that, you need to identify your search strategy amongst other things and identify which research approach you use and which of the legal reasoning skills that you prefer. Okay, let's get into legal research. Let's start by looking at the Central Queensland University Library database. I'm going to share my screen. Before I do, are there any questions or comments? You're all hanging in there. Nobody's hung up on the session so far. That's very good. Good. All right, let me share the screen. I've got 3 screens, so I'm going to hopefully select the right one. Can you see a screen that is the CQ University Library? Just give me a thumbs up or a nod. Yes? Couldn't see anyone give me any.
We can see your desktop.
My desktop?
Yep.
Not the CQ University?
No.
Right, okay. Let me try again. My apologies. I'll stop the share and I'll come back in. Share the screen. Try this one. Now can you see it? Now can you see CQ University?
Yeah, that's good.
Ah, very good. All right. Now I take it that everyone knows how to get there. So on that library landing page, you have Asli, which you can access independently of the library. You don't need that. Then you have the paid services. You have some dictionaries. You have encyclopedias. And you have, importantly, down the bottom, LexisNexis. LexisAU is where you'll probably go most of the time, and Westlaw. Of those databases, I think the really important ones are LexisNexis AU and Westlaw AU. Also important is CCH. Over on the left-hand side, from those sources, there are extracted some legal dictionaries and encyclopedias, and we'll talk about those. I take it that everyone has now done their homework and gone hunting around through the library resources and played around with these things. Have we all done that? Yes? If not, do that. And I'm serious when I say you'll have fun, but you need a lot of time. And don't try and rush it. This is something where you can just allow yourself to get immersed in the legal research. And there will be, as you go through, a lot of wow factors. Wow, I've got to remember that for future reference. And if you get one of those wow factors, think toolbox. That's going to go into my legal toolkit. Okay, so the research databases are basically free or they're paid. The free ones should not be discounted. Just because they're free, that does not mean that they're inferior in some ways. They're very good. The paid databases are excellent. We have wonderful resources. Let's start with Asli. Most times we start with Asli. Have any of you determined that there is, in fact, a beta website for Asli? Have you come across that? All right, I'll just show you what Asli will look like soon. Again, I'll share the screen. And what you're seeing there now is the beta version of Asli. This should be rolled out later this year. And that's what it's going to look like. That'll look probably unfamiliar to you if you're used to looking at the standard Asli website. So the standard Asli website is one that I want to call up now on that screen and go through in some detail. As you would know already, the Asli service provides information about primary sources and secondary sources of material. Over on the left-hand side, we have cases and legislation, Commonwealth and state and territories. Then we have various libraries, and we have access to up-to-date other information. Hopefully you've been through this site and played around with it. Spend a lot of time here. It's well worth the time and the effort. But let's identify a few things. The first is that Asli has access to a great number of databases. At the moment, it's 776. That's growing all the time. I think when I looked at this last week, it was 773. And certainly, if you look at some of the guides as to how to use Asli, so down here on the bottom right-hand side, and I must get Nicholas to show me how to use that laser pointer, unless anybody else can tell me how to use it. But otherwise, I'll just try and describe and wave my mouse around if you can see it. So the bottom right-hand side, we have the Asli user guide. Can you see that? Click on that. It will provide you with information about Asli. That's worth having a look at. And you'll see here that that information guide is well out of date in that it says it provides free access to over 430 databases. Well, that's clearly much more than that now. But that user guide is helpful in that it provides you with some information about connectors. You won't always need connectors. Many of these databases are now switching to a situation where you can simply type the material without necessarily using the Boolean or other connectors, but you may need the connectors. And if your results aren't coming through as you feel they should, try using the connectors rather than plain text. Print this user guide, follow it through, understand it, and I won't do any more on that right now. So I'll close that user guide. So legislation is over on the left-hand side, and I've already lost it. We'll go back and we'll get Asli. So on the left-hand side, we have the information about legislation and case law. And the information is up to date as we go. So it's very quickly and it's also consolidated. What that means is if you look at a piece of legislation, it will be as it is now. And thank you for letting me know that I'm not sharing the screen. I'll hopefully do that now. Sorry, thank you. So now you can see my screen again. So on the left-hand side, we have the legislation, which is also the link to the case law. As you go through that, you will be seeing the up-to-date or consolidated legislation rather than the individual pieces of legislation, which was the original and the amending acts. Now, David, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Anyone have any questions? All right. So on the left-hand side, we have the ability to search. Now let's look at an example. We'll go to Commonwealth, and I hope that you can see this. We'll go down to the database, which is Commonwealth Consolidated Acts. We'll go to the Acts Interpretation Act. Very slow internet. Sorry, Acts Interpretation Act. The Acts Interpretation Act is one that you want to have up your sleeve as a handy reference guide regularly. Look, let's try this. You, of course, have the option to go directly to the legislation by following the link, which is down on the left-hand side. But if you try search this act and we type in, so in the selected document, Interpretation and Constitution, you'll see there a list of sections within that act that relate to that search term. If we go to section 15A, you'll see then that the green arrows relate to what it is that we've searched. Up here on the ribbon at the top, you have the opportunity to move along section by section. Very importantly, if you haven't already looked at it, consider Note Up. Note Up is critically important. And what it means is that this citator is telling us anything that has been noted up in relation to that section. And when we talk about it being noted up in relation to the section, we're talking about whether there has been any judicial commentary or other commentary that's relevant to it. So if you've got a problem that relates to section 15 AA of the Acts Interpretation Act, coming to Asli using the Note Up facility will give you an opportunity to look at not only case law relevant to the section, but also articles of significance. And there are thousands of these things. Now, Asli also has all of the regulations and other legislative instruments. So when we talk about an instrument, we're really talking about something that is annexed to the legislation, and typically that would be regulations. So they're instances of subordinate legislation. And you can find the subordinate legislation here on Asli. Go back to Home, go back to Queensland, go to the legislation section, and you'll see things that will help you as you do your research. So at the top we have the Consolidated Acts. Consolidated meaning the original as amended by one or more amending acts to be in its current form. The numbered acts, if you want to look at the acts as they were actually passed, that's your opportunity to do so. There are the historical acts over on the right-hand side. Now below here, under legislation, we have consolidated regulations. That's very important in a practical sense. And over on the right-hand side, we have the explanatory notes from 1999. I'm going to stop here and look at those things. Firstly, the regulations. The regulations are instances of subordinate or delegated legislation. At random, I'll choose the, say, Property Law Act. And you'll see the property law regulations, which have things that make the Act work from an executive or administrative perspective. Again, you have the Note Up facilities, search this Act, so there's familiarity. If I go back a couple of levels, we should see the explanatory notes on the right-hand side. You need to know how to access explanatory notes, and you need to know what they are and how to use them. Let's take an example of an explanatory note. Again, I'll go to the, let's see, we'll go to 2000 this time. and we'll look at I'll go back 1999, to the Guardianship and Administration Bill. See, sometimes you need to go 1 year back. So the Guardianship and Administration Act was, I think, 2000, but the bill was 1999. So that makes sense, doesn't it? That sometimes the bill will take a year before it becomes legislation. So the explanatory notes are easily found and provide you with an excellent resource. Excellent in a number of ways. The first is that if you want some clear understanding as to why the legislation was introduced, you'll find that in the explanatory notes. If you're arguing that a certain interpretation about a provision in an act is the way you believe it should be, by referring to the explanatory notes, you've got a very strong argument to support what you say. Because you can say that when the Act was introduced, by way of explanation, by way of explanatory note, Parliament had this intention in mind, and it's very hard to argue against that. So, for example, Clause 12 of the Guardianship and Administration Act, when it was still a bill, was explained as giving the tribunal power to appoint guardians for personal matters in certain circumstances and on certain conditions in a certain manner. So it's an explanation. It's a really good explanation and one that you can use. So you must know how to access explanatory notes, and you must be able to use them in support of an argument. When you get to second and third year, if you're asked to do some work that involves describing, analysing, critiquing, summarising, inferring, anything of those legal skills, you're going to get much better marks if you can refer to the explanatory notes. We call them explanatory memorandum in the federal sphere. So you'll get bonus points. Make sure that you follow through, and you'll find these explanatory notes in the state jurisdiction in Queensland, and you'll find the explanatory memoranda under the Commonwealth. Asli has those explanatory memoranda in the Commonwealth jurisdiction at the moment going back to 1980, and that's growing. All right, so case law. In Asli, again, we go into this. This is where you'll go most of the time. Top left-hand side, cases and legislation. Queensland. Case law has, actually we'll go to Commonwealth, sorry. The Asli has all the case law of the High Court since 1901. So if we go to Commonwealth, you'll see all of the High Court decisions. Asli also has, of course, all the state and territory superior court decisions, Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, and it has the Commonwealth family and federal courts as far back as you're likely to need. But it has the High Court all the way back from the 1903, and it even has the Privy Council, which is where decisions used to go through to England. I won't click on those links now, but be aware that if you're looking for a decision of the High Court in, say, 1928, then you'll find it here. It's not the only place, necessarily, and it's not the authorised version of the decision, but here's a place where you'll find it. So Asli has a tremendous database of case law. That database is easily cross-referenced. So I showed you before where you could refer to legislation and then identify through the note-up facility what case law was relevant to it or what journals was relevant to it. The same thing applies in relation to looking at cases, and I'll come back to that shortly. In addition to the resources about Commonwealth and state parliament, legislation and case law, there are also tribunal decisions. So if we look at Queensland, you'll see there, for example, the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal appeals since 2010 and a wide range of earlier appeals. You'll see many of these other tribunals come to an end, and for example, the Queensland Guardianship and Administration Tribunal in 2009, it became one of the a great number of tribunals that were joined to create QCAT. That's why you'll see some of them come to an end. All right, so let's have a look at the search engines in Asli in a bit more detail. If we go back to the landing page, you'll see that there's a general search facility, and that's just a matter of typing in information, and you can access all of Asli's databases in that manner. There is a jurisdictional page, and that limits searches only to those jurisdictions that you want. There is the advanced search form, which you can access here on the front, which allows you to use special searches, for example, legislation only. Look, let's try something now, and I'm just going to cut and paste something that might be a useful exercise. And that is, I'm typing in a phrase, negligence and balcony and fall. Let's just see what happens here. All right, so we get 669 results for that. If we try the advanced search here, and we refine it by database to, say, the Queensland Court of Appeal, just panning down to Queensland Court of Appeal, if I can find it. Got a new mouse and it's a runaway. Queensland, where is it? Oh, Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, sorry. So if we try that, so my apologies. Of course, all this worked when I did the practice run. So the idea is that if you, I'll actually go back to the top. Let's go back to the start. We'll try that same negligence and balcony and fall, and I'll try it again this time using the advanced search, and then refine by database. Hopefully this will work. Otherwise I'll Supreme Court Court of Appeal. No, sorry, my apologies. I'll rework that and I'll do something in terms of correcting that. My apologies. All right.
John, does it only recognise the term "and" rather than having things in the quotation marks?
No, you can use other connectors such as "or." So if you use "or," that will identify whether a page contains either or of those terms. "Not" is another good one. You can use the word "not" or "near." And another one is you can put within a certain number. So W/say 15 means these words within 15 words of each other. is another good one as well. So thanks, Anita. All right, so if you've got Asli up on your screen, I'm going to ask if you could do a little exercise now, just quickly. Let's see if you can find Section 754 of the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act in Queensland and tell me if there's any case law applicable to that legislation. Can you do that for me now? Let's see how you go. Well, I'm sure you'll be better at this than I am.
John, can you just repeat what your question was?
Yep, sure.
Please?
So we're looking for the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act of Queensland. We're looking for Section 754, and we're looking to see if there's any case law applicable to that section. And if you could tell me, has anyone found it yet? If you've found an answer, let me know. So, of course, Police Powers and Responsibilities is Queensland. If you've gone to Commonwealth, you're in the wrong spot. Has anyone found any case law applicable to that section?
Roe versus Kemper.
What was that? Roe?
Roe versus Kemper.
Right. Who was that? Sorry, was that Melissa?
Yes.
How did you find that, Melissa?
I went into the Queensland Consolidated Acts,
Yes.
then went to the found that act, then looked for that section. Then once I got to that section, then I went to the note up.
To note up,
and
yeah.
That was the first case on the top of that list.
Okay, was that section 754?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. It's different to what I've got here.
Let me have a look.
But in light of my clear deficiencies in legal research skills, you may be right.
I got a list of cases. Would that be right?
Yes, Gay, yep. What's the top one on that list?
The top one is Shrubensny, but the second one is, that one. And the second one's Kelly versus Queensland.
Yep.
I've heard of that one before.
Okay.
The second time I went back into it, it was section 754, but when I went into the note up, the second time I went into the note up, it came up with Frequency.
Right, okay. And it sometimes depends on which area you look at, what's on the ribbon, you see, because you can identify it by citation frequency, database, by date, by relevance, or by title. So it defaulted, in my case, to the by relevance ribbon. Is anyone looking for that and they can't find it? There may be some that aren't looking at all, but is there anyone that's really struggling? Because if you are, we'll just work our way through that. All good? I'll just share my screen. So you'll see what the page that I was looking for that I think Gay and Melissa found, and you'll see the cases there. Yes, Melissa, anything?
No, sorry, just didn't mute it.
No, that's all right. So you can look by citation frequency. You'll see that changes the order of things. So the case that comes up most common, that's most often cited, is actually the Commissioner of Police against Magistrate Spencer. Forbes and Jingle come second, and then the Zabrensky case. By database, you can identify which ones were in the Supreme Court, which were in the district, which were in the magistrates, which were in the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, etc. And obviously, if you use that by database, you might be inclined to look at the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal first. By date, if you're looking for the most recent, was actually one this year, in June this year, relevant to that section. It's not the most frequently cited, it's not from the highest court, but if you're looking for the most recent, then that's the one. Then by relevance, which was where it defaulted for me, and I think Gay as well, or by title, which is really just alphabetical. Okay, so that exercise was useful, I think, in the sense that it gives you an opportunity to just play around with the databases and see what's there. Try every button, get to learn what's useful for you, and then make a mental note or make a proper note. Look, now that we're doing things, and can I just say that I used to do legal research in 1 week. Legal research is going to take us 3 weeks, and we'll just condense other things. We'll bring it in because it's really important. I want you to do this. Can anyone find for me in Asli the Queensland Criminal Code or the Criminal Code of Queensland? If you can, I want you to go to section 24 and find some cases. So we're after the Queensland Criminal Code or the Criminal Code of Queensland, whatever you want to call it.
Sorry, John, I've got a question already. Does that come up? I've got Criminal Code 1899 and Criminal Code Act 1899. Am I close?
You're close, and this is the tricky bit because we always talk about the criminal code, don't we? So just keep digging around a bit until you come up with what you believe is the criminal code, and more particularly section 24 of the criminal code.
That mistake of fact?
It is. Yes, that sounded like James.
Yeah.
Very good, James. And shortly we'll get you to tell us how you found it. When you get to mistake of fact, section 24, see if you can find some cases relevant to it. So firstly, has everyone found their way to section 24? Have you seen the trick to getting there? We'll come back to that. Has anyone found any cases using the note up facility, obviously? All right. Bit of a trick question. It's a bit of a dead end. I can't find any cases in Asli that relate to section 24. There are thousands of them. So Asli won't always provide you with the answers. That's where you need to look elsewhere. And it was a bit tricky because if you look at the Queensland Acts and the list of those acts as, was it Gay identified? You'll see both the Criminal Code Act, Criminal Code, 1899 and the Criminal Code Act 1899. Asli have recently introduced the Criminal Code. It wasn't there on its own previously, and you'd have to go a little further to find it. But if you go to the Criminal Code Act, you'll see that in that Act there is a schedule. Schedule 1 is the Criminal Code. So sometimes things that are very common in law, you'll find actually as a schedule to a piece of legislation. Now, with that hint in mind, can someone find for me you've all heard of this, the Australian Consumer Law. I want you to find section 29 of the Australian Consumer Law. Are we talking state or federal?
We're federal, aren't we?
I'd say so, yep. All right, let's see if we can find it. Section 29 of the Australian Consumer Law. Tell me what it's about. If this was a live session, first one who got this would get a birdie beetle. You've got to be pretty old to know what a birdie beetle is.
Sorry, John, what section of that Act was it?
Yep, section 29 of the Australian Consumer Law.
Which is false or misleading representation about goods or services?
Yes, very good. Birdie beetle flying your way, Melissa. Now, how did you find it, Melissa?
I went to the consumer, let me go back. I went to the Competition Consumer Act.
Yes.
And went down to the bottom of that and found that in the schedule.
Yep. So I gave a hint when I was talking about the criminal code by saying sometimes these really important, Gary says you're the teacher's pet. Some of these really important schedules you won't find directly. You have to find them as a schedule to an act. So the Australian Consumer Law is really common, but you've got to be able to find it. And sometimes you just know where it is. So you need to know that the Australian Consumer Law is actually a schedule to the Competition and Consumer Act 2010. You'd find that pretty quickly if you started to Google or look at secondary sources. Okay. And section 29 is all about false and misleading. I haven't checked. Are there any cases in relation to that, Melissa? Often you'll find in federal legislation in Asli there's no note-up facility. And has everyone been able to find section 29 now? Knowing that it's a schedule to the Competition and Consumer Act?
So, John, sorry. I'm sorry I asked so many questions. Sorry.
No, please
sorry,
do.
Everybody. So I was able to find the Act, but then once you get to the Act and then it says like search this Act, is that the quickest way, or is it just scrolling through the Act to look for the schedule where the
I knew it was in the schedule, so I just went straight to the bottom. But I hadn't tried searching the Act, but that should work. What did you do, Melissa? Did you just go straight to the schedule?
Yeah, I just went straight to the bottom of the page.
Okay.
But I can't open it up. Like when you go to that section, I can't open it up.
Doesn't work?
Up that. No.
Okay.
It tells me what it is, but it won't let me open up what the actual...
All right. I'll just share my screen. And what I've done is I've gone to section 29 of the Australian Consumer Law. I've clicked the Note Up function. You'll be starting to become familiar with this, and you'll see there that unlike many other instances of federal legislation, the Note Up facility does work, and in this instance there are many relevant cases. The same thing applies. Have a look at the database, for example. Again, it's very slow, the internet. And that will give you an idea of where these cases were heard. All right, that's just so slow. Any questions about those things? All right, now I'm going to ask you, oh, okay, so here it is. And you'll see there that the High Court has one document, but most of the cases are in the Federal Court of Australia. So the relevance of this is that if you're looking at legislation and you're wondering which would be the appropriate court, looking through Asli, looking at Note Up, looking at by database will give you a clear idea to advise a client with confidence where the matter is likely to be litigated. So if you have a problem in relation to the Australian consumer law, based on the results of the by database, you would think that the matter will likely be determined in the Federal Court of Australia. Do you understand that? Okay, so that's important. Now I want you to look at the state legislation again and have a look at section 16 of the Queensland Fair Trading Act. Has anyone found section 16? If so, let us know what it's all about. Gay has found it with a question mark. That's not a very confident answer, Gay. It looked right to me. Tell me when we found it. So what does section 16 of the Fair Trading Act Queensland say? Yes, David?
Is it application of Australian consumer law?
That's it. That's exactly right. So I wanted to show you that because sometimes the process of determining how something applies isn't necessarily straightforward. So what that tells me is that the Australian consumer law applies in state jurisdiction because of section 16 of the Fair Trading Act. And again, if we look at section 16, and I'll share my screen now, you'll see that we can once again use the Note Up facility. And here we have cases that deal with section 16 of the Fair Trading Act, which is the application of the Australian consumer law, but in a state context. And you'll see there that there are various cases that are heard in QCAT and the District Court and the Supreme Court, but they're all state jurisdiction courts there. Okay. Let's go back to the landing page for Asli. You'll see here LawSite. LawSite is a legal citator. Valuable. Let's search for Dietrich actually. I think I need to put that in here. If we search for that case, we come up with various matches. And you'll see here in this law citator that we have a reference to a case. There's a link, so you can view the case itself. You'll see the citations, and there are a number of citations. In Asli, it's under the High Court of Australia citation, HCA. That's not the authorised citation, but the 177 CLR is what we call the authorised citation, and we'll come back to what that means. You'll see that it's in the High Court. The full text is available here in Asli, and you'll see over on the right-hand side that Dietrich against the Crown has been cited on over 1,300 occasions. When you see that, you know that it is an authoritative case and one that you should pay attention to, as opposed to, for example, Dietrich Corporation against King Resources, which only has 8 citations, but it's from Worldly, so it's a case from the United States. So it's still relevant, but as you might expect, decisions in the High Court of Australia are much more likely to be relevant to our jurisdiction than decisions of a circuit court of the Court of Appeals in the United States. But the idea of LawCite is that it gives you another avenue to cross-reference material, to obtain information about material, and also to refer to matching journals. So if you had the task of, I don't know, analysing, critiquing, summarising the Dietrich against the Crown case, you are going to do much better in your assignment if you can find appropriate law journals. Going through LawCite is an easy way to find matching law journals that relate directly to that case. If you go into the case itself, that will also provide you with information that is relevant, because here we now have cases that refer to the case. I mentioned that it had been cited on many occasions. So if you want to know how later courts have dealt with the decision of Dietrich against the Crown, by clicking on the link through LawCite, you can see this list of citations to various cases in a whole range of jurisdictions: Supreme Court, District Court, Queensland, other states, even the Commonwealth. And that means that you then have an opportunity in your paper about the relevance of Dietrich against the Crown in today's society. You can refer to a case in Western Australia decided on the 20th of July as being relevant and an example of how Dietrich is relevant in today's society. So can you see how by playing around with these buttons, just push on these, click on these buttons, you're going to obtain much more relevant information. I've run out of time. It's going to take us a little while to get through this, but what I'd recommend is, if you haven't already done so, make yourself half a dozen cups of tea during a day and just spend a day doing this, going through all these links. You'll find things that you can tell me about, and I hope you do. And as for me, I'm going to go back and I wanted to help in terms of finding some information for a case that was being considered by Hannah. Sorry, Hannah, but if you have luck with your research, let us know. Okay, we'll see you next week. Before we do, are there any questions? I'm sorry I haven't been following the chat facility that much. And Melissa said, how do you determine whether a rule or precedent has been determined by the case? That's a judgment call. Obviously, if you're dealing with a high court case, it is going to have authoritative effect. Sometimes you'll see the citation information, and we'll go through that further, does provide a guide as to whether it's been adopted or not. So when you're in LawCite, on the right-hand side, have a click on that button and you'll see further information about the legislation cited and other information as well. And that gives you a good idea as to whether it's an appropriate precedent or not. Sorry, that's a bit vague, but we'll talk more about that. Gary says, how do you search from scratch after identifying an area of law? Well, yeah, there is a lot more that we're going to show you in legal research. I guess many commentators say go to the secondary sources first, just to do some broad reading, and that's probably a good idea. From that, you'll normally identify a leading case or cases and pieces of legislation. Once you've narrowed it down to that point, you can then go into something like LawSite to expand on your research inquiries. So to answer your question, Gary, probably do some reading in the secondary sources first up. Okay. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, you've got plenty of homework looking through all of these databases, and we've got a whole lot we've still got to go through. All the best for now, and we'll see you then. Okay. Bye.